All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So we now have Lieutenant Colonel Pete Combe, who's going to talk about a Bayesian approach to risk assessment and communication, which I struggled with as I read through, but I think it helps to explain a bit of a gap in some strategic level thinking that I will let him explain.
Lieutenant Colonel Pete Combe. I'm a judge advocate by MOS. And the basic construct of my future war paper is how to get after risk in global integrated campaigning. Particularly, we think about the joint concept for integrated campaigning. So this is the agenda, right? I won't belabor that. So we talked a little bit before we came online, right? How did I come across this? Why did I kind of seize on this as being an issue? And the so what is I was working in the SJA shop with US SOCOM. We're looking at a lot of trans-regional threats, particularly state actors, and looking at opportunities below the threshold of armed conflict, right? And if you see the slide there, right, so there's Iran and Hezbollah, some of their proxies kicking around in Venezuela, as well as some other places outside of the CENTCOM AOR. Russia, they're in the center. They've got private military contractors. They've got military, kind of their equivalent of foreign military sales, and all sorts of other things going on in Africa. China is darn near everywhere, right? And the question that we would continually get is, hey, here is an opportunity for us to do something against, again, Iran or China or Russia, but we don't have the capacity to get after all of those things consistently. So nobody was sort of giving us guidance on what that looked like. So in the absence of guidance, we wrote our own.
Yeah.
True kind of SOCOM fashion, right? But the perspective there was, hey, I need to have a good understanding of where am I trying to get to? What are my campaign objectives? What are my priorities? And then where I kind of took my paper was one aspect of that, or what are the risks associated with it, right? Because we don't have the capacity to get after all these things at one time, right? If I've got to choose between 8 or 12 different opportunities, which one do I get after? So I'm trying to inform a part of that, right? And I think this is complicated when we talk trans-regionally, because you'll have the global coordinating authorities for particular problem sets, which from the geographic combatant commands is usually the geographic combatant commander in whose AOR that threat is located, right? So EUCOM is the coordinating authority for Russia, but AFRICOM sees the problem differently, right? Than EUCOM will see it, right? So how do you adjudicate that between AFRICOM, who's the approval authority, and then EUCOM, who is the global coordinating authority?
Okay.
So the other issue that I looked at as I was working through the CJCS manual on risk analysis and communication is it's just not well suited to this new construct of global integrated campaigning, and particularly the JKIC as it talks about campaigning as a verb as opposed to a campaign as a noun, right? And there's been an update to the CJCS manual on risk analysis just this past October that I think at least has a view towards some of these problems, but doesn't tell you how to get after it and doesn't develop sort of a process for how to get after what I see as kind of being the primary sort of shortfalls, right? And I list them there. One is it takes this pseudo-deterministic approach to assessing likelihood, and I'll talk through deterministic, probabilistic, and then two different models of probabilistic, with the caveat that I'm not a data scientist. So conceptually, I have a good understanding of these things. But as far as nuts and bolts, maybe less so, right? The joint risk analysis methodology looks at drivers' risks, threats, and hazards as independent as opposed to interdependent, right, and interrelated. And while there's been an effort recently to kind of work through inter-organizational risk dependencies, I don't know that it really gets after the problem. Risk assessments tend to be static, particularly when we're talking about force allocation, force management decisions. You think the GFM process, the biweekly SDOB, SecDef orders book, right? So those risk assessments tend to be static and not dynamic or updated in real time or near real time. And they lack context vis-a-vis the prospective opportunities that we're seeking to gain.
Okay.
Right. There's kind of lip service paid to that in the manual, but there's not really a methodology to be able to really understand, here's my priorities, here's where the risk weighs out. How do I kind of merge those two things together, right? And I talk about decision theory in my paper, which is a way to kind of get after that. So when we think about globally integrated campaigning, the JKIC, Joint Concept for Integrated Campaigning, talks about the factors of those campaigns. And what I did is I looked at, okay, which of the 13 factors, which of these are relevant, or which of these kind of weigh most heavily on risk analysis and risk communication. And I've listed them there. And if I had to boil it down to a bumper sticker, right, one of them is a thing that I already said is campaigning as a verb as opposed to campaign as a noun, right? So it's a continuous process where you're seeking to shape the environment below the threshold of armed conflict to set the conditions to be able to get after a concept plan or a contingency plan, right? So that's kind of what you're getting after. And then the other piece of it, and there's some time-informed horizons there, but those are in terms of, right, force employment, 1 to 3 years, force development, in the kind of 2 to 5 year time frame, and then force design, which is maybe the 7 to 10 year time frame.
Okay.
So it's time informed, but that doesn't mean that it's dynamic or updated in real time.
It's just a snapshot.
It's a snapshot of where we are today, and not necessarily updated if and as conditions change. There's also some effort to get after kind of the intra-organizational piece, within DoD, right? If I'm going to do something in one combatant command, how does that affect another service or another combatant command? And that's helpful. I still think that's part of it because one of the key pieces of the JKIC, right, is that DoD oftentimes, and perhaps most of the time, below the threshold of armed conflict, is a supporting effort, right, and is enabling other non-defense federal departments and agencies. And this is, again, one of the things that we saw in SOCOM quite a bit, right, is, hey, Department of State has this effort that they want to get after. They need, they need some of the SOCOM capabilities to help get after it, right? And one of the things that I talk about that, I suppose it's fair that the president and the director of the CIA made it public, right? It's DoD support to CIA covert activities, right? And how do you adjudicate sort of the different risk tolerance and risk models as between those different agencies when DoD capabilities are directly supporting another department or agency's operations or mission, right? Right. When I talk Bayesian, right, I came across Thomas Bayes a lot, right? He's a Protestant minister. He's a deeply religious guy. He's trying to develop a model to try and assess the likelihood that God does or does not exist. His methodology is essentially like a bet or a wager, right? And it's based on the power of assumptions. But a little bit of background, I think, helps kind of understand what his model is, right? So if we talk deterministic versus probabilistic, and I think one of my big problems with the assessment of likelihood in the CJCS manual is that it takes kind of this false deterministic model, right? You work through these categories, you say, okay, here's the percentage likelihood that something's going to happen. And the thing with deterministic is your dependent variable is a direct function of your independent variable. So it's essentially perfectly predictive, which is not realistic, right? And it's terribly ill-suited to either complex environments or uncertainty. You contrast that with probabilistic, right? Which seeks to assess the likelihood of a future event based on the observation of kind of the world around you. It's very, one school of thought is an inductive. Right? I've looked at kind of specific instances in the past, and I look to extrapolate that to the future. So in those instances, your dependent variable is a combination of a function of your independent variable, as well as the model that you're looking to apply to your understanding, right? So that's kind of the difference between deterministic and probabilistic. So, and in probabilistic, you can break out into frequentist as opposed to Bayesian, right? And frequentist is really very much an inductive model. I look to observe specific past instances and then extrapolate that to the future. There's a degree to which you have to kind of abstract out some of the complexity, and you'll see this quite a bit. But I think, the so what there is you're looking to observe, or you're looking to assess the likelihood of a future outcome for which you have specific instances in the past. Right? So you're using past information to assess the likelihood of a similar or same outcome in the future, right? But it's an inductive model. And in those models, the data is more important and kind of informs the construction of your model. Bayesian inference is a little bit different. You start with a model, right? Talking a lot in terms of priors. Priors are essentially assumptions. It's assumptions about how the world works. And oftentimes you'll have data on past events that aren't specifically the thing that you're looking to assess, but you believe there to be a relationship, right? So you make some assumptions about what that relationship is. So that's kind of your priors, right? Or your assumptions, and you have a model of likelihood based on that. And then the beauty of Bayesian inference is as you observe those outcomes kind of come to reality, the built-in construct, if you're doing it right, is that you update your model.
Okay.
So then you have a posterior kind of distribution of likelihood.
Okay.
Right. So to me, like as I was reading through these things, I was like, that's fantastic because right now, December 19, January 20, CENTCOM is a very, very kind of dynamic environment. After kind of the back and forth tit for tat between us and Iran kind of culminates in the Qasem Soleimani, right, strike. And right, there's a lot of uncertainty. It's kind of a new environment that we didn't really have a lot of good models built for. And it's like, okay, well, you know, CENTCOM Commander General McKenzie, he wants an extra carrier presence. Great. Like, how do we assess and understand what the risk looks like to say Indo-PACOM or future carrier maintenance cycles or all those sorts of things if we're going to do that, right? So we're that to me was the strength of a Bayesian kind of model of inference, right? And this is kind of a morbid example of how kind of a Bayesian inference works, but to me this shows both kind of the way in which a Bayesian model for inference can contradict sort of your common sense understanding of the way the world works, but also the degree to which your model is really, really important, right?
Okay.
And your assumptions are really, really important. So what this is kind of a descriptor of the likelihood of having cancer in the event that you test positive for cancer, right? And you can look at overall cancer rates within the population, right? Which the model here says is basically 0.5%, so 0.5%, right? The accuracy of the test is 85% accurate, right? So kind of your common sense answer is, well, if I have a positive test, that means I'm 85% likely to have cancer, right? But if you combine those two numbers, what you actually come out with is approximately a 5.5% likelihood that someone has cancer if testing positive. Big, right? Now, one of the assumptions in this model, right, and this is why assumptions are so important, is that your tested population is kind of an agnostic cross-section or representative sample of the population as a whole, right? What you may need to do as you work through this is understand, well, maybe people who are showing signs or indicators of cancer are more likely to pursue testing. So perhaps your percentage of folks who test positive is actually higher than your predictive model, right? So as you work through this, you would update your model based on those new assumptions, right? So this, as I talked about previously, right, you have kind of your prior distribution, then you do the testing, you'd have an observed distribution, and then you have a posterior distribution, which is your updated model. And as I was trying to think through, what does this framework look like? I think we have to have a risk assessment and communication methodology that's interdependent, and not just across drivers of risk, not just across threats or hazards, right? It's got to be intra-organizational, so within DoD. It's also got to be inter-organizational. We really have to understand what other departments and agencies are doing, what their risk tolerance is, what risk we may be assuming that they would bear the cost for, and vice versa if we're going to provide DoD forces in support of
that. I think understanding their risk models as well, what they're using.
Exactly. I think it's got to be dynamic, right? And I like to say real-time updating. I'm not sure that may be a bridge too far, but I think near real-time updating. I think automation is key. One of the things I was struck by as I was having conversations with folks at headquarters Marine Corps and then the Joint Staff, J5 and J8, right, like in some basement office down at the Pentagon, right, is if I have a work at TIPFID, right? I'm sorry, I'll back through. Combatant Command requests forces. I go to the SDOB. SecDef approves deployment of those forces. That force is allocated against numerous con plans across multiple geographic commands, right? Because we don't have enough to do everything.
Yeah.
SecDef signs off on it, right? And it goes into the tip vid. That tip vid doesn't automatically update the directed readiness table. So you don't just automatically update the dirt, right? And then in the event that force is deployed, it doesn't automatically update the kind of force availability assessment for all those other con plans. So you have these kind of like multiple cascading effects, right? Okay. So I say automation, but maybe it's less than that, and it's simply just system interoperability, right? Okay. Which is this kind of amorphous goal that DoD is constantly chasing and has never been able to kind of get our hands on and kind of wrestle it to the ground.
We'll get there someday. Yeah.
Exactly. And then I think users as data generators, right? And I think this ties back to the previous one. As I'm working through those problem sets and I'm entering data into whether it's a tip vid system or the dirt or something like that is generating data at the user level. Okay. And then probabilistic. So I think Bayesian is the right approach because it is a good mix of inductive and deductive. It's well suited to uncertainty. There's a degree to which you kind of start from scratch and you have to build out your assumptions to go with. But I think this is one of those ones where you can support that with decision theory, which helps understand risks in relationship to priorities, but it also helps to understand kind of the adversary's approach to those things, right? How do they view risks and priorities, and how is their behavior likely to change? Probability theory, which sort of the kind of the crux of this whole thing. Well-structured tasks and queues. One of the things I came across, the guy Phil Tetlock wrote a book, Super Forecasting, which I found really, really good. He's got something called the Good Judgment Project. And kind of the overall thesis there is a holistic understanding is well suited to conditions of uncertainty or understanding complex environments, as opposed to the fragility of narrow predictive models, right? Okay. And I think in a lot of ways that's what we're looking to get at. He also worked with a congressionally chartered, it's the National Academy of Sciences, to work a project for intelligence analysis for kind of tomorrow. And he talks quite a bit about these well-structured tasks and queues, capturing caveats or capturing dissenting opinions, and also being able to understand and communicate the weaknesses in either the underlying data or in the models that you're using to predict future outcomes. Okay. So I've gone way over my 15 minutes, so I apologize.
That was good.
And then I think the other thing is coalition, interagency, and then DoD subject matter expert input, right? Because that really, the assumptions that go into your risk assessment model, if you're going to use a Bayesian framework, are critical to kind of the outcomes that you're going to get, right? So having that subject matter expert input to be able to say, these are the assumptions that we should take into these kind of uncertain environments, I think it is critically important. So, so that's my concept.
Now, you talked about the risk of the initial assumption, right? It takes the data to actually build them out, but over time, these would be more mature and then survive, or would they necessarily shift as larger events kind of change what's happening, the interactions?
So one of the things that I was intrigued by as I was looking at this, right, is as I'm predicting kind of further out in the future, right? Like uncertainty is higher, kind of the further out in the future I look to project or I look to assess, right? But as the conditions change, you would update the model to have a better understanding of kind of the environment as a whole. But there certainly comes a point where the uncertain, theoretically, there comes a point where it's near enough in time that the uncertainty you can rely on a more frequentist looking approach to things, where you have enough like events that you can then assess. So I'm not sure where you kind of snap the chalk line on, okay, here's where we stop changing, or here's where we stop altering the model for this specific event that we're looking to forecast.
Okay.
I think that exists somewhere. But again, I'm kind of in the conceptual space here.
Okay.
I know that's probably not a satisfying answer.
No, that's good. That's good. Well, shall we open up to the virtual audience or live audience for any questions?
Sir, good morning. I'm not going to pretend to understand all of what just got said, but what I think I took away from it here was the model that you are supporting appears to be in favor of groups of SMEs making educated assessments and estimates over the existing model that we use. Is that anywhere close to accurate? Over.
So I think that's a piece of it, and forgive me if that wasn't terribly clear. Ultimately, right, the assumption of risk is a commander's business. And what I'm concerned with is, and I think, you know, I'm looking at this probably at the Joint Staff or the Department of Defense level, right? And if we're going to the Secretary of Defense, you know, to allocate forces for a contingency plan, and I've got two different combatant commanders in a service saying, well, this is the risk if you do this, or this is the risk if you don't do this, that there's not sort of an intellectually disciplined and well-structured way to communicate those risks to the Secretary of Defense, right? And so that's what I'm trying to get at. And I'm not saying that it's necessarily groups of SMEs who are driving the process. That's a decision support tool for the commander to better understand risk. Because as I look at the way the process works now, I think for the reasons I outlined that the model is lacking, but I also think the communication to the commander in terms of understanding the weaknesses of that model is lacking, right? So that's where I think the subject matter expert input is key, and having these well-structured tasks and cues to be able to communicate, you know, dissenting opinions, caveats, or here are the weaknesses in your data or your model as we're looking to assess moving forward. That may or may not be an answer, so.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Now, you talk about this operating obviously at the higher echelons, but I still see a lot of applicability, right? So as an intelligence community, one of the things that we try and build into our processes is that understanding of the risks of the decisions that you're making or the recommendations that you're making. So I absolutely think that with continued effort to try and help inform the processes down to the tactical and operational level, I think this is useful. So thank you very much. All right. Lieutenant Colonel Pete Combe, thank you very much. This has been informative. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.